Good morning. We want to welcome you to this 10th session as we are going through Jewish history. Again, we need to move quickly because there are important things that happened over the last 200 years, and I've just been so excited about ancient history that as we say in Hebrew, "Anachnu tzrichim lazuz," we need to move. Okay, so we have just come out of the Byzantine period. Byzantine church is a description of a church that originally started in the Middle East. It started out of the ashes of the Roman Empire, as supposedly Roman Empire had converted to the Christendom of the day. We know that by the time Constantine, quote-unquote, converted, Christendom had become pretty much corrupt. It had taken several steps away from its biblical foundations. Yes, there were some true believers, and we have records of those individuals, but increasingly there were sorts of movements creeping into the church in those early years, and I'm talking 250, 300 AD. You start to see anti-Semitic writings from some of those ante-Nicene church fathers, and it increasingly they are paving the way for doctrinal disputes and doctrinal problems, whereas the teaching of the New Testament was clear about many things. Within 200 years, it doesn't take very long for doctrine to go off the rails. We've seen it in a much shorter time period in our own nation. And so 200 years or 150 years is plenty of time for things to first drift and then to go off the rails. And so that was certainly the case during the Byzantine time period. Again, there were some true believers, but oftentimes the leadership was in there to build a dynasty. And so ultimately the Byzantine church is now pressured by a new movement that comes out of Saudi Arabia with a vengeful sword. And that, of course, is the rise of the movement known as Islam, a word which means submission. And Muhammad and his cohorts would demand that everyone bow in submission to this new religion. Not a study at all on Islam, but one of the realities is Muhammad is this young man who has a lot of time on his hands. He has an older woman who is his benefactor, and he has a lot of time to think about religious movements. He studies Judaism, he studies Christendom. Understand, I'm using the phrase Christendom instead of Christianity. It's biblical Christianity. And on the other hand, there is institutional Christendom, which is oftentimes a very different animal. And so he studies the Judaism of the day. Saudi Arabia at this time had large communities of Jewish people. Mecca, Medina, some of those areas were on the trade routes. We have records, even in Islamic literature, that there were large Jewish communities in Saudi Arabia. There were Byzantine communities in Saudi Arabia. And so Muhammad had a lot of opportunity to study both of those religions, but his goal was to make a super religion that would combine the best of what he saw in Judaism and Christianity, and to then offer that as a religion to the desert-dwelling pagans that still inhabited parts of Saudi Arabia. And he imagined that by combining the best of Judaism, the best of Christianity, throw in a little moon worship. Why do you think that there is a crescent moon on the top of mosques? There are a number of things, the black stone, a number of these things which were brought forward from the old moon worship that had roots in Jericho. In Jericho, there was a very strong center of moon worship, all up and down the Jordan Valley, that extended all the way down even into Saudi Arabia. And so he combines Judaism, Christendom and moon worship, imagining that he's going to make this super religion, which will be irresistible to the population. As soon as people get a whiff of it, they'll say, this is what I've been waiting for. And they will flock en masse, happily submitting to the religion of submission, Islam. That didn't happen. So Muhammad sharpened his sword, used all kinds of violence, all kinds of threats, and a lot of what he used was outright subterfuge. He would he would threaten a group, and when they sought to make a peace treaty, he would make a peace treaty with them, and then in the middle of the night, he and his men would swoop down and slaughter everyone. Later on, there will be a Muslim ruler called Saladin, and this was his military tactic. He would offer the peaceful terms, the peace of Saladin. The peace of Saladin was simply a subterfuge so that he had time to rearm and ultimately to attack. And so this is simple reality. This is simple historical fact. It is fact that horrifies us. On the other hand, it is also acknowledged as fact in the Muslim world, but they look at those things as being praiseworthy because he was simply using tactics and strategy to try to enlighten the world. All who would not submit to the Prophet of Islam, whose name I'm avoiding mentioning here, all who would not submit would face death. And ultimately, they would ravage the Jewish populations, they would ravage Christian populations, and force conversions. So during this time, you have this movement centered around Mecca, Medina, but you also have Judaism making converts among the local populace in the general Middle East. So that's an interesting, and these were voluntary converts. Under the Hasmonean dynasty, the descendants of the Maccabees, there were forced conversions, or conversions under duress. If you wanted to get ahead in that world, you converted, and of course the Herod family was one of those who converted in that way. As from the year 630 onward, as Islam becomes the dominant religion first in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, Jews resist. And then when they are overpowered, become second-class citizens. There is a whole category of literature in the Quran and in auxiliary writings that allows second-class citizenship for individuals who do not embrace Islam. One of the things that you need to keep in mind is that Islam has not been historically a single sort of religion. It's not monolithic. It has not always acted in the same way. There have been times during the history of Islam when there have been moderate, somewhat reasonable Muslim rulers. And they have allowed this class of dhimmi, this second-class citizens, whereby Jews and members of churches who are willing to pay a certain tax are allowed to remain in Muslim-controlled areas, allowed to have businesses with lots of restrictions. There are restrictions on the height of churches and synagogues. There are all kinds of restrictions on what businesses they can enter. But oftentimes they are allowed to be second-class citizens. Again, this is all dependent upon which Muslim ruler happens to be in power. There have been moderate Muslim rulers, most notably in Spain. There was a time period when Muslims ruled southern Spain and were happy to allow Jewish people to live and to flourish in that time period. We'll probably get to that in just a bit here. So some Jewish institutions flourished during this time, because if you go into the Quran, you will find contradictory statements. You will find some statements that say to respect the people of the book and kind of don't Don't slaughter them. Give them, if they don't convert, they're second-class citizens, but don't disrespect them. Allow them to live among you. And on other passages in the Quran, there are passages that call upon faithful Muslims to slaughter Jews indiscriminately. And it describes in very graphic detail what you should do to Jewish people should you happen upon them. And it's in that way, it is like Gemara, in that you can prove anything you want from the Gemara section of Talmud. Remember, we had said that Talmud is the set of some 30 volumes that guide Orthodox Judaism, and there's an older section called Mishnah, but then there's an ocean called Gemara. The Gemara section are debates amongst rabbis. They don't agree with one another. As a result, if you have a certain point of view, you can selectively go into Gemara, you can cherry pick only the views that agree with your own and present that as the view of Judaism. Of course, that's dishonest, but the same thing is possible in the Quran for those who know how to use it. So some Jewish institutions flourished during this time. Again, even during a single time period, Islam is not monolithic. When you go from one country to another, you may have a strict Islamic ruler in one country. You may have an easygoing guy in another country. And again, oftentimes, the further you get from Saudi Arabia, the more moderate the Islam becomes. So if Saudi Arabia is down here, and you go across the Mediterranean over to Spain, that form of Islam was very moderate. They recognized the contribution that Jewish people could make to their communities. And in places like Spain, when Jewish people considered their options, they recognized that their lot in life actually would be better under moderate, reasonable Muslim rulers than under the Byzantine Church. Oftentimes, under the Byzantines, it was a very harsh life. They were restricted in many ways, not in all communities and not at all times. But overall, you could live and your family could flourish under certain moderate, tolerant Muslim rulers. And that brings about the golden age of Spanish Jewry. This would flourish for many years, and we're going to see it in this a little bit in this timeline. So, just a historical, by review, historical timeline of the Middle East. Around 630, there is the conquering of Mecca. There are mass conversions to Islam. 636, the Islamic army sweep out of Saudi Arabia, come north and conquer and occupy Israel, which had been under Byzantine control. The Byzantines collapsed very, very quickly because they were really not set up militarily to resist this well-trained and well-motivated army. The first mosque is built upon the Temple Mount. Just a quick timeline here. Obviously, in the year 70, the temple is destroyed. Roman religion is still pagan religion, and so at various times there were certain pagan temples that were built upon the ruins of the Jewish temple. Our records are not complete for that time period, but we know that there were several different ones. Ultimately, Constantine has his conversion, and churches are erected in and around Jerusalem, but never actually on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount was basically a plateau of a ruin of old buildings. And so in 685, the first mosque is built on the Temple Mount. Jews are allowed to remain in Jerusalem under heavy taxation. Okay, so that is essentially the case. Of course, they immediately set about to convert the local Arabs. And again, the local Arabs at that time oftentimes were moon worshippers. The cycles of the moon were very attractive to them, and they saw that because Islam is about 1/3 moon worship, they found easy converts amongst these Arabs in that local area. So we say at this point that Palestinian Jews and Arabs, because once again, the word Palestinian or the word Palestine doesn't refer to an ethnic race of people. It doesn't refer to one single cohesive ethnic identity. There's no intrinsic Palestinian food to the exclusion of all else. There are many strains that come into making what is Palestinian, and at various times, when you said the word Palestinian, you meant a Jewish resident of the area known as Palestine. It's just that that term has shifted, been used and been misused and misappropriated over the years. The people in that area are ruled over by outsiders. They're ruled from Mecca and Medina. They're ruled from Saudi Arabia. That is still the power base. Islam is expanding across the world at this point, and they have quickly taken over Syria. They've gone up into Turkey. They've gone across the peninsula, and they are threatening Greece, and they are now getting in boats, and they were very skillful navigators of the Mediterranean. They planned an invasion of Rome. The invasion of Rome was partially successful. In the year 846, had Rome attacked Muslims? No. Roman Catholicism had not attacked Muslims. But in 846, Muslims assembled a large armada of ships, as much of an armada as they could have in those days. They were older, smaller vessels, but they were very effective weapons of war. They had thousands upon thousands of trained commando warriors in these ships, landed there on the beaches not too far from Rome, and they sacked and pillaged Rome before armies could come from outside the city to repel the attackers. There was gross massacre of ordinary Italian people by these Islamic terrorists. There's no justification. There's no West Bank. There's no grievance that the Muslims have. It was simply a bloodthirsty terrorism to try to subdue anyone who disagreed with them. And you see that as the raw character of Islam in this instance. And so the attack is eventually repelled, but certain sections of what used to be known as Yugoslavia are subdued. If you know anything of recent history, you know that there were wars in Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, Serbia against this one. And there are people there who are Muslims who don't fit the stereotypical look of Muslims. They're not Middle Eastern. They are white Europeans. Well, they are white Europeans who had been forcibly converted to Islam in and around the 800s, when Islamic armies came up from Turkey, swept through that whole area of Serbia, Croatia, Albania. Albania is mostly, for the most part, Islamic. And they were forcibly converted during this time period. At the same time, whoever was ruling in Israel had a moderate view toward Jews. They were willing to allow Jews to coexist with them. As a result, by the year 1050, under this moderate regime, Jewish population in Israel increases to over 250,000 people. So you have a very large, substantial Jewish population in Israel. And at this point, it's so large that they start to rival the Jewish population of Babylon. And so now you have two centers. By 1099, it becomes obvious that unless the Western world of Christendom does something to unite and to oppose the spread and the conquest desires of Islam, that the Islamic armies would just pick off one country by another, because the Western world was not united. And so there was a crusade that was launched in the Western nations of Christendom, in places like northern Spain, throughout France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany. All of these countries agreed to send trained armies and untrained armies to try to push back Islam. This is where things actually get mixed up with modern politics. These people are 99.9%, the people who perpetrated the Crusades. They're, for the most part, these are people who are marauders and adventurers. They were not followers of the person or the teachings of Jesus, but they get labeled with the subscription here, the superscription of being Christians, Christians against Muslims. We understand that the scriptures hold us to a much higher definition of what a Christian actually is. These folks were church members. They were loyal church members. And they also were told that when we're successful, there's going to be a big payday for you. You get all the spoils on the way there, and if we conquer any villages, you can do what you want with the people in those villages. I don't have to fill in the rest. And so there was an opening of prisons, and in Europe they let out the prisoners, and they say, if you join the army, we'll let you out of prison. You go fight in the battle, and with God's help, you're going to survive. You'll come back to Europe, you'll be a free man, and you'll have a bag of gold, because there's plenty of gold there in the Middle East. So that was the idea. On their way to the Middle East, the Crusaders would need to cross through many areas in Eastern Europe that had large Jewish populations. The Crusaders would have large crosses. I think I've got some illustrations here in a bit. Let me kind of go forward. No, we don't. Okay. So the Crusaders would have, let me go back here. The Crusaders would have crosses. They would have shields with crosses on it. And they would raise their sword, and they would promise to conquer in the name of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. And so it now becomes a battle of Catholicism, of Christendom, which was really the only visible representation of anything Christendom, was the church at Rome. Certainly, yes, there was an Eastern church, but at this point, the Eastern church is relatively weak. They had not really gotten involved with this. They were trying to sit out on the sidelines. And so this first crusade in 1099, as it goes through Jewish areas of Europe on their way to the Middle East, basically they say, let's practice our massacre skills and let's fall upon these Jewish communities and massacre them, take their gold, and take whatever else we want from these communities on our way to the Holy Land. We don't have time, this is not the time and place to detail some of those things, but they were severe, they were brutal, they were horrific, rape, murder, and pillage. Why am I spending a little time on this? Because in the last 3-5 years, I'm starting to see material on the internet from conservative evangelical sources that are attempting to provide an apologetic for the Crusades. And it's not as though the material is actually wrong, because that material will mention the crimes of Islam against Christian communities. They will mention the sack and pillage of Rome in 846, that you had a relatively peaceful city that is all of a sudden sacked and pillaged. Horrific things happened. They take all the gold they can find in the Vatican. They rampage through the Vatican, try to destroy it, and only leave when they hear the armies are a few hours away to repel them. And then they get in ships and they sail back. So yes, there are many grievances that were fair and understandable that the Crusaders had. But what is missing generally in these apologetics for the Crusades is any acknowledgement of the following two facts. These people were not Christian crusaders. Their loyalty was again to a church institution. They might have had the liturgy that sounds Christian, and there certainly might have been, and I don't deny that there certainly might have been certain individuals who can be found, and perhaps some of their, I've seen prose and poetry from some of the commanders that certainly seems as though they had a personal, heartfelt faith in Jesus as the Savior. So that certainly has been true, but they were in the tiny minority. The vast majority of the Crusaders were opportunists, were thugs, were criminals, were out for blood and out to strengthen their countries. And so these apologetics for the Crusaders ignore that fact, and they also ignore the horrific massacre and slaughter that the Crusaders perpetrated upon sleepy, innocent Jewish villages that had no means to defend themselves. They were just trying to eke out a living. Picture the village of Anatevka in the movie Fiddler on the Roof. When you have even poorly trained Cossacks fall upon that village, they are defenseless. People with swords and weapons of war. And so please don't jump on the bandwagon of somehow elevating the Crusaders as some wonderful force for good. Like most human endeavors, it was a mixed bag. There are evangelical crusades who go off to this country or that country or the other country, and a lot of good things can happen. But sometimes people bring their evil habits along with them, and sometimes bad things have happened. And so we need to have our eyes wide open to